Well, this is Tony Gosling speaking from Coromandel in New Zealand, stuck here now for goodness knows how, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, and I'm joined by Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers. We're still waiting for a slot. We basically got our radio show ready to do as a live show on BCFM, but they are on an emergency schedule, and we're waiting for our slot in order to get back on and do it live, within the COVID rules and the social distancing. But in the meantime, we thought we'd bring everyone up to date with what's been going on, and we can do this as an internet show, so at least people who are coming onto the website to listen to the programme have got something to listen to. So hopefully next week we will be able to give you a slot. At the moment, the Dialect Show, which is our sister show, goes out on BCFM at 10 p.m. on Mondays. And although it's been the same show for a couple of weeks, we're hoping that that's going to be on Monday refreshed with a new programme, really just relying on people at BCFM, the tech staff, to put our programmes into the slot there, and also to give us the codes or whatever it is in order to get into the server to do the live programme. But we're pretty much ready to go now after what is now, they're describing it here in New Zealand, and I rather like that, as the 8th of lockdown. So seeing this as something which may last for a long time, the 8th day of lockdown. Martin, how's things over in Bristol? Have you been going out much?
No, I mean, everybody's been sent home effectively. We are allowed to go out to shop once a day or for exercise, but in theory everybody's staying home, which of course is a lot easier for people in Clifton with nice big gardens than it is for people living in the tower blocks in Barton Hill. Although I was walking up in Clifton on Tuesday, it was quite a nice day, so I went and had a walk up there, and of course a lot of the big houses are empty because the people have fled to the country, which of course they're not supposed to do.
Well, that's an equivalent here really in New Zealand, is that we're in a sort of coastal area, and many of the New Zealanders, much more than in the UK even, have got second homes. Many of the places here are empty because people have decided for whatever reason to stay in the cities. Although quite a few decided, I suppose, at the last minute to come out to their, country retreat and go through the lockdown out here. I mean, basically there's pretty much nothing open apart from in the smaller towns, maybe one grocery shop and or post office if it's rolled into one. And in the bigger towns, just one or two big supermarkets and the pharmacies are open. The petrol stations, and pretty much nothing else. Is it the same in Bristol?
Well, the supermarkets are open, but of course they've been inundated with people trying to buy stuff. In Easton, where I live, we've got a very unique retail infrastructure with lots of little shops run often by ethnic minority owners, and we've been very lucky because they're all still functioning. But of course, how long that will continue is anybody's guess.
Yeah, basically what seems to be happening here is in the bigger towns, a lot of the smaller places are closing. In fact, I was in a place called Whitianga, I think it was, or maybe Whangamata here in New Zealand, and there was one guy who had a small grocery shop who it's quite clear he can't restock. He's just basically opening the doors to sell off everything he has to basically cash in and clear out. That seems to be the way that's happening. Some people are just trying to get rid of all their stock.
Well, I think if you actually look at it, there is no real problem in the short run or even the medium term of food supplies in developed countries. The supermarkets are taking staff on in the warehouses. Of course, there's a big question about how safe that is, whether they're really capable of managing that safely. But Martin, who's the head of Wetherspoons, got excoriated last week because he sacked all of his staff because all the pubs have shut, and he's just said, well, why don't you all go and work in Tesco's? And of course, I've seen video from the US of Amazon hiring new people because Amazon is obviously doing very well out of the crisis, and they've got all these people crammed in while they get shown a video about what working with Amazon's going to be like, and there's somebody sent a video of it out and around, so they're showing no social distancing at all. So you can imagine working in their warehouses is possibly a death sentence. So all of these things are coming to a head.
Well, I mean, I think that's a bit sensationalist, death sentence, because many of the people, I think, and it's certainly the Oxford University report is suggesting that possibly even up to half people in Britain have actually already contracted this coronavirus. This is quite a sensational story. It hasn't really been covered very much in the Financial Times, and several of my personal friends, including someone we've had on the show, Glenn Jenkins from Luton, the activist from the Exodus Collective, the Free Party people, several others have had very bad bouts of flu with 3 or 4 days in bed, high fever, and this dry cough lagging on for maybe 2 weeks after they've had the fever, and even a personal friend of mine, Mike Zare, he died over the Christmas break of an extremely powerful flu, basically, and where he couldn't breathe, and he died. So I think that there's quite a lot of evidence out there that many people have had this. What do you make of that, Martin?
Well, I think what makes this particularly difficult virus to deal with is a sort of very long incubation period. And obviously the first reported deaths were in Wuhan, but of course if what you're suggesting is correct, and I suspect it may be, then it's been circulating for quite a while before Wuhan. Now,
there is more evidence of that. There is more evidence of that from Seattle in the US. In November and December, there were flu samples taken, and it suggested that they also tested positive for coronavirus, and this is back in November, December, but that the fact that they did the US authorities didn't want that to be known. So it looks as if, in the US and in the UK and possibly in other places, this particular virus was circulating. It was causing a very nasty flu, and yet it wasn't actually recognised until it arrived in China. I mean, how do you think it got to China, or why would it not be recognised until then?
All right, well, Larry Romanoff, who's a US citizen based in Shanghai, his theory about this, don't forget that Fort Detrick in Maryland, which is the US equivalent of Porton Down, and they've got hundreds of these laboratories around the world, but that's the main one, that's their Porton Down. That was closed down from July to November in 2019 for some kind of violation of safety procedures. Now, most people aren't aware of that, but that's a definite fact. And Whitney Webb has just written a very good article about it, which I've sent you, Tony, and which presumably we can put up on the feed for people to have a look at. Now, what Romanoff is suggesting is that something leaked from there at that stage, and then it's been running around in the US and therefore being exported elsewhere. So some people are saying that the first cases that they picked up in Hawaii, for example, a Japanese tourist picked it up in advance of everybody else. And then, of course, if it was an accident, they then decided to pin the blame on the Chinese by making sure that they leaked it inside at Wuhan. And, of course, what's happening now is the US military and the right wing in the US and the hawks are suggesting that the Chinese should be blamed for the whole thing because it leaked from their biological warfare laboratory at Wuhan. Now, of course, what the Chinese have immediately said back, and the government spokesperson has said it, is what your military were here, the British military were there as well at the so-called military games in Wuhan, which took place, I think, in October, November of 2019, and I never knew this thing existed, but they have something called the military games, where all the armies of the world, including presumably the Russian army, etc., all go to do these games once every 4 years, and they all went to Wuhan. And I understand that several of the US team were hospitalised at the time, And also, of course, the US and a lot of the people who compete in these games are actually professional athletes pretending to be military. And they didn't win any gold medals at all, which is very suspicious, apparently.
Okay.
But
Well,
anyway,
also, Martin, we had, didn't we? We had Mike Pompeo as part of a press conference actually stating that this was a live exercise. Now, was that a slip of the tongue? What does he mean by that?
Well, I think what's interesting is, as you know, the 201 exercise, which was carried out just before all of this with
okay, you're talking about event. You're talking about event 201, yeah.
As a possible thing that they've got to deal with.
Yeah, Event 201 actually predicted 65 million deaths in a viral outbreak, and that was taking place at the same time as the World Military Games in Wuhan.
Yes, indeed, and we're talking about the military games in Wuhan and this exercise that they carried out, and Pompeo saying this is an exercise and so on. There's a very good article by William Engdahl, which I've also sent you, Tony, which we can put up on the feed, about the actual structure of the World Health Organization, which has become a public-private partnership. It's effectively dominated by private interests, and those private interests are the pharmaceutical companies.
Well, I know Bill Gates himself. Bill Gates himself is very influential in the World Health Organization.
Indeed. In other words, because of the cutbacks and austerity caused by the last round of insanity in 2008, the World Health Organization, which is supposedly funded by governments, has ended up being funded by the pharmaceutical industry. Now, you might ask yourself, why do profit-making companies donate to the World Health Organization? It's not, I would suggest, necessarily because they are philanthropic. And of course, underlying all of this, people say, well, why would they do something like that? Because this is clearly a very catastrophic virus, whatever it is, which is destroying the economy. Now, in actual fact, the economy was already on the ropes anyway.
Well, look, talking about the economic side of it all, which doesn't really seem to have been mentioned, it looks like, possibly the majority of medium and small businesses are going to be wiped out by this completely. And big business, like you were talking about Amazon earlier, but many of the other enormous companies, we're talking about the Walmarts of this world, the retailers, obviously the petrol companies, they're not going to do too well out of the lowering oil price. But these companies which are allowed to stay open may be the only ones left, Martin.
Well, they may. And of course, the destruction, the thing is that the bubble, the everything bubble, which has been building since 2008, 12 years of funny money, that was crashing in September. The Federal Reserve was intervening in the repo market to prop up the banks, pretending that they weren't going back to full-on quantitative easing, because they were, the message was that everything's ticking over, Trump's going to be re-elected, the capitalist economy has recovered from the crisis, but that wasn't the case even before this virus came along. So the virus, if you think about it, is a very convenient cover for the collapse of the stock market. And also, of course, if you knew that this was going to happen, then you could make an awful lot of money out of it, because that's the way futures markets work. And there's already talk in the US of senior politicians basically being told by the public health people that they were going to have a lockdown. They then went on TV and said everything's going to be all right, meanwhile telling their brokers to sell everything on Wall Street. Now, we had the biggest bubble in history. If you can manage to sell your holding in the biggest bubble in history just before it collapses, you're laughing all the way, not from the bank, because you've taken the money out of the bank. And all of this suggests a concatenation between public and private.
What you're describing there is the most incredibly audacious insider dealing you can imagine.
Yeah, but don't forget that the Russian military and the Chinese military and the Iranian military are well aware that the 9/11 attack was carried out within the US security forces. They don't trust these people, and they've got every reason not to trust
just
them.
one example is Bill Ackman. He's a US trader, Martin, Bill Ackman, who's reported by Business Insider as turning an investment of $27 million literally within a week to $2.6 billion. So that's 100 times more money in a week than he invested. And this is all through the futures markets and basically the casinos.
You've got inside. I mean, on a smaller scale, the assassination of Soleimani in January. Obviously, Boris Johnson wasn't told about it. The Americans didn't bother to tell him what they were going to do. But of course, some people did know that that's what they were going to do. People like Mike Pompeo, who probably made the decision. Now, Mike Pompeo's got loads of friends in Wall Street, Bill and Melinda Gates, maybe various other people, and they just tell them we're actually going to assassinate Soleimani. And they don't even have to say that. Say you sell, and you're going to make some money. We'll show you why and how. And of course that means that you're consolidating more and more power in criminal hands. So in other words, what we're talking about here is the 9/11 attack was an audacious attack. It shocked and horrified everybody, and of course more and more's come out about what really was behind that. As Donald Trump said on the day, those buildings were bombed.
Well, I'll tell you what, something else has come out, and Alaska University has ruled 100% that the Building 7, which came down without a plane hitting it, definitely didn't come down due to a fire. They're really hinting, they're not spelling it out, but they're hinting that it was a controlled demolition.
Well, it's got to be. There's no other way to describe. I mean, Richard Gage, who set up architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, did a pretty good presentation when he came to Bristol all those years ago. There's no other explanation because the amount of energy involved, buildings don't collapse.
Yeah, that was the Bristol Post headline, 9/11, the bombs theory, the headline on the front page.
Indeed, and Pompeo is on the record as talking to some students at West Point, saying that you West Point guys, you're taught never to cheat, lie, cheat and steal. And I have to tell you, as ex-CIA, that's what we used to have courses on lying, cheating and stealing, and they all had a good old laugh about it. Now, at the same moment as Pompeo is coming out with all this stuff, and Trump is saying that he's going to save the world, Trump pointed out on 9/11 that the buildings must have been bombed. That's what he said, and of course he's right, and that means Al-Qaeda couldn't have possibly have done it. And secondly, Pompeo was on the record as saying, I lie, cheat and steal, now believe what I say about coronavirus. Now in actual fact, as you can imagine, Shoigu, who's the Russian defense minister, and whoever the equivalent is in China, and this new head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, who's already said, we're not happy with your explanations, they don't believe this. They believe that this is actually, quite possibly, a military operation.
Okay, well, I mean, coming back to the economic side, this week actually, on the 1st of April, and it's no April Fool's joke, this one, the Federal Reserve has taken on the role of the world's central bank by pumping out dollars. So says Rich Miller on Bloomberg. The Federal Reserve is acting as central banker to the world by seeking to provide the global financial system with the dollar liquidity it needs to avoid seizing up. Now, I mean, one does wonder if the actual economy, that is to say the manufacturing economy, the service economy, I mean, that does seem to be seizing up, but apparently they want to make sure that the financialised side of the economy, that is to say money trading, shares, asset prices, that sort of thing, keeps going.
Yeah, well, I mean, what they're doing is a crisis like this, as Naomi Klein pointed out in her book, The Shock Doctrine, a crisis like this allows you to bring forward stuff that wouldn't otherwise be feasible. So the Federal Reserve is not supposed to lend to non-US entities. They did in 2008. They were effectively the world's central bank, and they are the world's central bank now. What they do, everybody else has to follow. But of course, they've not got a mandate for doing any of these things. But of course, the crisis allows them to mandate what mandate. And so what they've actually done is channeled massive resources into the financial sector, supposedly to prop it up. Yeah. Meanwhile, they're covering this time by saying we're going to give $1,500 to every poor US citizen who's been put out of work here. So don't say we never give you anything.
They're trying to sweeten the pill. Yeah.
Can I just finish the point? It won't actually rescue the financial system.
No, of course not.
What it does is it gives a last push of money into the system so that the insiders can then rake off what they're going to take. It's what it's called control fraud by police officers. So they then take the the last bit of money, and then they walk away with all the money. And then the financial system, which they're not protecting the real economy, but even the financial system that they're supposed to be protecting is also marked for death. But of course, that doesn't matter if you've taken your money out from the inside before the get-go.
I mean, surely, Martin, just a minute, for loads of people who are struggling in the US, this, whatever it is, $1,500 or whatever, is an absolute godsend right now.
It's hopeless. It doesn't even cover 1 week's rent for most people. What it is a subterfuge to cover up the fact that they're shoveling all of this money to the airlines. It's not just the banks that are being bailed out here. We've got Richard Branson is demanding bailouts for Virgin Airlines here, even though he's not paid any tax in this country for years, and he sued the NHS because he didn't get a contract.
Okay, so I mean, here's the $64,000 question: is the lockdown necessary?
I think if, as I suggest, this is a bioweapon as part of a psychological warfare attack, then you have to take it seriously. People are definitely dying. You can't fake all of that. It's a very dangerous virus because lots of people who don't show symptoms carry on doing what they're doing and therefore infect others. The only answer to this is a military answer, which is the sort of thing we saw in China. They treated it as a biowarfare attack. They tested to find out who'd got it. They randomly tested to see how far it was spreading, and then they used the techniques that the Chinese Communist Party have got for controlling the population to do what they needed to do to try and bring it under control. But they've already put the flag up and said we think there's something.
Okay, so 2 winters ago in Britain we had 50,000 extra deaths due to the flu. We haven't reached anything like that here in the UK, something like a 50th of it. So, I mean, surely, I mean, there is an argument here to say that this isn't any worse than a really bad bout of flu. I mean, a nasty one, but no worse.
All right, well, I've got two answers to that. One is the incubation period means that we're not really sure how many people are going to die ultimately from this. And secondly, remind me of the question again.
Well, it's just that we have 50,000 people 2 winters ago, 2017, 2018 winter, 50,000 people died of the flu. Right. Extra. That's on top of what normally, and we get 2,500 people dying every day in Britain.
Okay, but when the medical personnel who are treating elderly people dying of flu with multiple conditions, they don't get it and die at the same time. Now, if this is a designed virus, it's designed to cause maximum economic disruption with minimum casualties, so that the healthy military, the young guys, they don't die. All of these old people who are going to be sucking up pensions and demanding healthcare, they do die.
I mean, what do you make of Sweden, where they haven't had a lockdown?
Well, I think they're going to have one soon enough, because Denmark and Norway, who are their neighbours, have got the lockdown that everybody else has got. And if Sweden doesn't join in, they won't let people from Sweden come to Denmark and Norway. That's why Britain caved in and had a lockdown.
Well, yes, I mean we've seen this in Europe already, though. I mean we've seen this elsewhere in Europe with borders closing already.
Yeah. So in other words, those who want to be outliers and pursue a different strategy, as was obviously the case in Britain, they are forced into line by what other people do. Macron basically said to Johnson on the phone, if you don't have a lockdown like we're having, we're going to close the channel, and you cannot bring people into France from your country.
Do you think that do you think that the government is weaker now? It seems to have borrowed lots and lots and lots more money from the city again.
Well, the point is that what's happened now is all of the constraints on borrowing money have been thrown out of the window. Now, when we had a general election last December here, the Labour Party put forward a well-costed but ambitious manifesto to rebuild Britain with the public sector in the lead role, and it was rubbished as absolutely undoable, load of nonsense, can't do that, and the usual conservative forces prevented anything from happening on that front. Now, where some months later, any amount of money can be spent, but it's not going to be spent on improvements. It's just going to be spent on emergency management. And the government will just shrug their shoulders and say, what could we do? But of course, ultimately, they're protecting. In the US, it's become very clear that the wealthy 1% are being protected by these measures. In Britain, up to now, we've got the idea that the government is, the left here, the mainstream left, are welcoming the government's intervention. And therefore they're seeing it, they're being blindsided in my view, because ultimately this is going to be a bailout for the wealthy and not for the poor. And the only way to really deal with this would be to have we should have had a basic citizen's income in this country brought in after the 2008 crash, and then we were in a perfect position. It would be like having an airbag in the car. Yeah. So
okay. Martin, also we've got to move on a bit. Coronavirus test kits shipped into the UK were found to be contaminated with the live COVID-19 virus. This is from the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Express. Michael Gove claimed the government's goal of carrying out 10,000 tests a day had been reached on Sunday, but they've been importing loads of these test kits. Telegraph and Express saying, well, the test kits were actually contaminated with the live virus. Now, is it possible that is an accident?
Well, I don't know. That is a detail that I'd have to, it's either true or it's not, and you've got to check the detail. I think the fact is that it's quite clear that the decision here that they weren't going to pursue testing meant that there's a market for these kits out there, and we didn't join it. So now we want to try and test. All the other countries are testing, but there's hardly any tests available. And that's because we spent several weeks pretending we didn't want to test at all. That what Matt Hancock said last night was that we're going to test 100,000 people, I think it's 100,000 people a month or something, I can't remember. But anyway, we're going for full-on testing now. And he said we're going to set a target and we're going to go for it.
But the thing is, at the same time, Martin, at the same time, a lot of doctors around the world are on the record as saying that they don't believe people with no symptoms should be tested. Although, of course, true. Well, a lot of doctors are saying that.
In South Korea and China, they tested randomly, because you need to know how far it's spreading. Because it's got such a long incubation period, it's not like SARS or MERS or ordinary flu. You've got to know, it's like HIV. Yeah, it's got a long incubation period. So people are wandering around perfectly okay and perhaps will never show any symptoms, but they're basically infecting everybody else. Now, in that case, you've got to test everybody at random to get some idea of how fast it's spreading and how long the incubation period is. And you're never going to know unless you carry out random testing, which, of course, is what the Chinese and the South Koreans did from the get-go.
Okay, Truthstream Media in the US have done a very good video about this. I think it's well worth watching, called the 12 Monkeys video. They cite a Massachusetts Institute of Technology article which came out on the 17th of March, a couple of weeks ago now, but it's in something called Technology Review. But the headline is, "This is not a temporary disruption. It's the start of a completely different way of life. We're not going back to normal," they say. And what they're talking about here is the likelihood that after a month or so of lockdown, we'll have a week of going relatively back to normal, relaxing some of the rules, and then the rates of coronavirus infection will start going up and they'll be locked down again. And this will literally carry on for months and months. So, a month of lockdown, a week or so of freedom, another month of lockdown. And what Truthstream have pointed out is this is very much like the sort of shock doctrine, the idea that we're being put into a situation that we would desperately like to get out of, almost like an electric shock every month, and then you get a little bit of freedom, and everybody, of course, will want to go back to normal. What they're suggesting on Truthstream is that there's this ID 2020 that Bill Gates has got, and that's effectively what they're going to try and do. Is to say, well, once you've had the coronavirus vaccine, then you will be able to go back to normal. And we're thinking about even up to 18 months' time to develop that. And they're saying that once you've got this digital ID, this ID 2020 of Bill Gates's, then you'll be able to do things like use public transport normally, go to pubs, do all the things you normally do, but not if you haven't got the ID card.
Well, I was just going to say that. It's problem, reaction, solution, isn't it? There'll be a solution offered by the pharmaceutical companies, backed up by the governments they control, and then you can get your digital vaccination, which will have a digital aspect to it, so that they can just scan you and say that you've had the vaccination.
Can I just ask you, Martin, what's your best guess as to how long the lockdown will last? We were told 4 weeks, 3 weeks, and there are many people suggesting different times. Some saying, well, actually it might last till July, others saying 18 months, like I just mentioned.
Well, unless there's a vaccine, it's ongoing, isn't it? Because as long as we haven't got a cure for it, and we haven't got a vaccine, then it's going to carry on spreading, whether it's a bioweapon or natural. Yeah, either way.
I mean, I would say particularly for anyone.
We could have a major war.
Well, yes. I mean, this is the next aspect I was going to come on to. But before that, I would just say for listeners with elderly relatives and loved ones, particularly if they're in their bubble, because that's what we do here in New Zealand. Everyone is in a bubble, and it may be a family of up to, say, even 8-10 people all living in the same house. That's one bubble, and you don't leave the bubble. If you do leave the bubble, or if you go out as a group, and you don't go outside that small group. So the bubble thing seems to have really taken off here. What I'm saying is that the elderly people within that bubble, just make sure that they've got a high dose vitamin C in the morning, 500 milligrams, and high dose vitamin C in the evening. The reason I say this is because, I mean, there are other supplements, obviously, but this is the key one because from all of the stuff I've read, and certainly from people I've seen do well under viruses, who have had a virus and actually coped quite well, is if you've got all this vitamin C hanging around in your body, it's the building blocks to build your antibodies. So as soon as the virus arrives, by whatever means it does turn up, it just means that you've got a head start on fighting it. If your immune system, whatever state it is, it's going to do it better at fighting the coronavirus if you've got plenty of vitamin C hanging around in your body. So I would definitely advise that. I wonder if you have any thoughts about health stuff, Martin.
Well, I mean, on a health front, the whole point of having a lockdown is not that you're going to stop the spread of the virus. People still have to go out and
You're just going to slow it down.
Hello?
You're just going to...
It's to slow it down.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, lots of people are taking precautions who probably don't need to take precautions. Yeah? There'll be some parts of rural Britain, for example, where there won't be any coronavirus. You can be pretty much certain there won't be. But if you don't take the precautions, there will be. And ultimately, that you're trying to slow it down. That's the goal. And you've got to recognise that you're never going to be able to stop human interaction completely. That's not feasible, is it?
Okay, so what about, Martin, let's get on to this...
They've got to be realistic.
If
you ask people...
Yeah,
I mean,
let's get on to this idea...
to go back to the townships and stay in their shacks. Now, they've got 40% unemployment in the best of times in South Africa. People have to go out every day to hustle, to sell little things, to steal, to do whatever they need to do.
I mean, in some parts of the world, in some parts of the world, in some parts of the world, this is going to be absolutely devastating. I wonder if we'll be seeing that happening on the BBC with Laura Koonsberg and the rest of them. Anyway, what about this idea that you mentioned there briefly about potentially a world war coming out of this? Because we've been talking about this for a long time, Martin, haven't we? You know, the tensions, particularly between Iran and Israel, the potential of, I mean, of course, NATO and Turkey has still got a foothold in Syria. Anything that kicked off there would be definitely going to be dragging in the United States into a war footing where the Russians are already there. And, of course, if the US and the Russians were to start contesting parts of northern Syria, the Chinese would almost certainly start getting involved in one way or another as well. So we do have the potential for a world war. How do you think this lockdown could be related to it or lead to it? Or, how do the two sit together?
All right, well, Guterres, who's the head of the UN, is a former Portuguese socialist politician, but he's regarded as pretty much under Western control. He's saying, well, we need to have ceasefires all over the world. All of the countries that are under sanctions, that's, Venezuela, Russia, China, Iran, Nicaragua, North Korea, they've all put a motion into the United Nations saying, can you please lift sanctions on us just while this crisis is on? And of course they've got a very dusty answer from the US. The US is actually intensifying sanctions, although pretending otherwise, on their enemies. So the whole thing is being treated as an opportunity to further push the agenda.
Okay, so the closest place to the United States, of course, is Venezuela. I understand there's been some military moves against them.
Yeah, well, yes, well, a puppet court in the United States has accused Maduro and various other people in the Venezuelan government of being narco-terrorists. That is to say, they're both terrorists and they're funding themselves through sending cocaine to the United States, which is pretty laughable if you know the history of the CIA.
Well, I mean, yeah, they're accusing Maduro of doing what they've been doing for the last 20, 30 years.
Well, exactly. And they've also sent a naval task force to stand off the Venezuelan coast. So they're obviously trying to push for they're trying to use it to push for the overthrow of the government in Venezuela, which they've been looking for ages anyway. The same in Iran. So when the Iranians started to become a hotspot, various US politicians were openly on Twitter crowing about the fact that senior people in Iran were all dying of coronavirus.
Okay, but so how does the lockdown fit into this, if at all?
Well, the lockdown is a way of... Let's, for example, imagine that Britain gets dragged into a war with Iran over what's going on in Iraq. Normally, people like myself would be out in the streets protesting against it. With a lockdown, we can't. Can you see how all this fits together? Okay,
yes, I certainly can. I mean, you know, we've been talking quite a bit about the economic side of it, which does seem to me to be like a sort of 2008 on steroids, really, with the big corporations taking all
the... People are going to die as a result of the economic collapse than they're going to die of the virus.
Quite possibly.
That doesn't mean you can... Why? Because in Britain, for example, which is a developed country, loads of people are having their absolutely vital operations cancelled because of coronavirus. So they're going to die. And it's not coronavirus that's going to kill them, is it? And that doesn't mean that let's not have a lockdown, because you've got to have a lockdown. It's a bioweapon, yeah? So you've got to have a lockdown.
And I just thought we'd have... I mean, we've been ranting on for quite a while now, but I thought it would be nice to have a little clip with one of the last people we had on the show when we were broadcasting live on FM on the Friday Politics show from Eastern, you know, before I came out to New Zealand, which was Michael Hudson. I mean, maybe you could just introduce him a little bit by talking about his book, Killing the Host, which is a bit of a classic, really, in economics.
Yeah, well, I mean, Hudson's an old guy. He's a professor, and he's been around for years. He's also worked in Wall Street. He's also working very closely at the moment with Paul Craig Roberts, who used to be Reagan's economic advisor. And David Stockman is another interesting character. Stockman and Roberts used to be the economic brains behind Reagan. So back in the day, I used to hate those guys. But they've gradually come round to a very much more serious view of the world. And, you know, they know a lot. Incidentally, both of those people, and I presume Michael Hudson, are aware that 9/11 was carried out from inside the US security forces. They just know it. They openly
I mean,
say
what he's about to talk about here is the way that the methods used in Chile were picked up in the United States, in the Bush regime and the Obama government, and how actually violence is an absolutely key part. He cites here the murder of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X by the FBI, and he says unless he can't see any other way that violence, that this is going to end, Martin. So let's have a listen to that now.
Okay, regarding what you said about Chile, I wish you're all familiar with Chile. That was the model for the George Bush administration and especially for the Obama administration. The genius of the Chicago boys who designed Chile was you can't have a free market unless you're willing to kill everybody who disagrees with you. You have to kill every labor leader, every land reformer, every protest. If you don't kill them, there's going to be a protest, and that is probably the leading premise of free enterprise economics. I can't figure out why they don't put this in the textbook, because that's the first thing they do in practice. They had a Chicago boy one of the Chicago boys who designed it was Professor Harberger at Chicago, and he tried to get a job at Harvard as head of the Harvard Institute of International Development, and I'm proud of the I was associated with the Peabody Museum there. The students all rebelled by saying, this is the guy who sat in his hotel room fingering who was going to be assassinated to create the free market. Chile had a great tactic for wiping out really all of the pensions. George Bush said that he took the Chile's plan as a pension plan as the ideal for what America should have. He called it people's capitalism, and the idea was you give workers a share stock in the company they work for. Sounds good and you have many fraudsters supporting that as sort of workers' capitalism. What the Chileans did was saying, okay, we have this factory, we'll give the workers stock in it, but we're also going to have another corporation. And we have a whole group of corporations, and it'll be a financial corporation that lends money to the factory that the workers work for. And so they were called the grupos in Spanish. And so the corporations would lend money to the factory, and the workers would take much less, part of their wages would be set aside. Instead of giving them money for wages, you'd give them stock in the company, and then all of a sudden the creditor would foreclose, the corporation would go bankrupt, wiping out all the stockholders. This immediately became the model for how U.S. companies should work. You had the Chicago Tribune bought out by Sam Zell, a real estate guy who had the Tribune people put all of the workers, reporters and typesetters, put their salary into the Tribune stock. He had organized the financial shell, foreclosed, wiped out all the workers. So you want to really beware of people's capitalism, that if it's wrapped in a financial shell, which is what the Spanish did. And you have Pinero, who designed the plan, who I think is still there, and there has to be a revolution against him, and that's what you're having in Chile right now. There really is no solution except revolution. I guess truth and advertising. I must say my father was committed to jail for advocating the overthrow of the government by force and violence, the Smith Act, but it was a frame-up. But I just had to acknowledge a little bit of prejudice there when it comes to how to solve things. So yes, that. The intention of the people who run the American government, both parties, are to wipe out the pension funds in a way much like happened in Chile, and to cut back Social Security. Regarding the what is the second system of the political system? What to do? I don't think there is a solution under the American political system. There's a difference between a problem and a quandary. A problem can be solved. If we were in Europe, you'd start your own party, you'd get all the votes, and you'd throw out the other people. But you're in a quandary. There's no way out. You can't start your own party because the Democrat Party are the 12 richest people, the Wall Street thugs who run the whole party, and they don't care what the voters vote for. It's all a charade. They've already picked. They want Donald Trump for the second term. Is the ideal Democrat. So, or the ideal kleptocrat, or whatever you call the stage of finance capitalism that we're in today. So you talked about the answer is class consciousness. Well, class consciousness was easy 100 years ago. The class you're in, you were wage earners. And the problem were the people who employed you and were trying to pay you as little as possible and calling in the thugs to beat you up if you went on strike and calling in the FBI to deport you or to frame you up or to shoot you or Malcolm X or Martin Luther King. So the problem is I don't see any way out except violence. I'm not advocating that. Don't want to, but I don't see any other way out. Otherwise, you're going to starve quietly in the dark.
He finishes off by just saying, And if if the only other alternative to violence potentially in the future, he's not advocating it. He's just trying to say that's the way things are. He's starving quietly in the dark, Martin.
Yeah, well, that's a very negative analysis, much of which I agree with. But of course, the analysis is very well understood by the Russian military and by the Chinese military. And they're not saying very much. They're keeping their counsel. But don't presume that it's just nutcases like me and you on Skype that the enemy have got to worry about.
Fear is the devil's most powerful weapon. But, I mean, there is a lot of fear involved in all of this, isn't there?
Well, of course, it's psychological warfare. So fear is the key. But then, of course, if you steady the line, ultimately, this is also a possibility that this is the biggest crisis of our lifetime.
Okay, so I think you might be right, but
maybe that the evil forces at work here have overreached themselves. Let's hope so.
I mean, to what extent do you think this is about the viruses, or is it about other things, as more important geopolitics?
The virus, which as you've pointed out, is not that deadly compared to previous viruses or bacteriums. It's basically all the knock-on effects which are the devastating impact. And of course, more people are going to die from the secondary effects than are going to die from the primary effects. And there's nothing to be done about that. They're all you can't separate the one from the other. They're all linked. And of course, this kind of evil has been inflicted on the poor people of the planet for decades. Look at Iraq. Absolutely devastated by years of Western sanctions, bombings, depleted uranium, you name it, they've had to suck it up. And of course what happens is people living in their bubbles think it's happened to somebody else, and now it's going to happen to them.
Okay, what about, the oil companies? The oil companies are very well known as some of the most powerful businesses on the planet. It don't look like they're going to do particularly well out of this. We've seen January, it was $65 or $85 a barrel. Now we're down to, in many cases, less than $10 a barrel. Is this going to be the end of the oil industry? Are they prepared for this?
No, it's not going to be the end of the oil industry, because unfortunately we haven't diversified from oil as the major source of what makes the economy run. The oil industry is being done by oversupply because OPEC's has broken down, and that's a deliberate policy by the Russians and the Saudis to break the US shale industry. I mean, they're looking for market share now. You see, this is a price war in oligopolistic terms in the textbook. So you're not looking to make profit, you're looking for market share, because if you can get the biggest market share when the show's over, you can make your profits because you're becoming dominant in the industry. Yeah. So the Americans were pushing their shale oil industry. That's going to be wiped out now. And of course, the shale oil industry wipeout is going to wipe out a big chunk of the derivatives market. But the derivatives market's going to go down the drain anyway, because everything's going down the drain simultaneously.
Okay, so why does this economic stuff necessarily start moving, towards actual fighting war? Is there really any correlation?
Because trade wars, historically, trade wars are real wars. The sanctions on Iran, which have been on for years, have killed millions, probably, of Iranians indirectly. Now, that is an act of war, whether it's called war or not. It is an act of war. And, of course, it's no different, really. It's like a medieval siege. Some people are killed by crossbow bolts, and other people die through lack of food and illness. But in actual fact, it's all warfare. The crossbow bolt is just the cherry on the cake.
I think
were settled by starvation and disease.
Didn't they used to lob corpses in with all sorts of horrible things like plague?
So there's a story about the Black Death, that the Mongols who were besieging Kaffa in the Crimea threw infected corpses into the town, and that infected the people in Kaffa, and then the Genoese who controlled Kaffa went back to Genoa, and then went all around Europe as a result of coming in through Genoa. Now, all of these things have been coming to a head since 9/11, and going back to the post-Second World War period, when basically fascist people were integrated into the Western intelligence structure, and these people are quite literally psychopaths, a bit like the Nazis were psychopaths. Invasion of Russia was basically a mad gamble which led to the complete destruction of the Nazi state. But they didn't stop them. They did it anyway. And the people behind what's going on now are of that ilk.
Okay, I think it'd be nice to finish by looking at this contested debate discussion. I mean, we've covered Andrew Wakefield quite a few times on the show over the last few years. This is the discredited Dr. Andrew Wakefield, but what he says seems to make a lot of sense. The thing is, he doesn't get any airtime at all. I mean, I'm not saying 100% I agree with him at all, but I think we should certainly listen to him in this time where vaccinations are being put forward as the panacea, which is going to be the only solution. Someone who's been criticising it from an intellectual, from a medical point of view for a long time. So I thought we'd have a listen to a bit of a clip from him. And this is not obviously about the coronavirus, but this is his analysis of the measles virus and the way that herd immunity had begun to be built up until the 1960s and 70s. And then he's here describing what he calls vaccine failure and why he calls it vaccine failure in measles.
You'll be aware that in 2015 there was an outbreak of measles at Disneyland, and what that allowed is for Senator Pan to put pressure upon the California legislature that led to the passage of SB 277, and unfortunately the likely passage of SB 276 as a fully intended, always intended follow-up to his original bill. In that year, they had samples of measles virus isolates taken from people who had measles around the country, including that outbreak in Disneyland, and there were 190-odd isolates that they had. And they sequenced those isolates, they chopped them up into their component genomic elements, and they were able to say whether they were vaccine strain or natural measles. And some 38% of those cases, diagnosed cases of measles, were found to be caused by the vaccine itself. But they didn't say anything. They said nothing at all. They said nothing at all until about a month ago when this came out as a mention in another paper. During the measles outbreak in California in 2015, a large number of suspected cases occurred in recent vaccinees. Of the 194 measles cases sequences obtained in the United States in 2015, 73 were identified as vaccine sequences, unpublished data. Why did they not publish that? I'll tell you why. Because they could never have passed SB 277 if they had. If they'd gone to the legislature in California and said, we want to mandate vaccination across the board for all children or no school, private or public. Oh, but by the way, approaching half the cases were caused by the vaccine. Then they would have been laughed out of court. And so they didn't tell anyone. And so the politicians were deceived, the doctors were deceived, the public were deceived, everybody was deceived. They would never have passed that bill if the truth had been known. Not only are we facing people getting the disease as a cause caused by the vaccine itself, but we are facing vaccine failure. And the entire point of this lecture is it's not failure to vaccinate, it's vaccine failure that is the problem. Let me move on. A measles outbreak occurred in New York City. All cases had prior evidence of measles immunity. Symptoms were consistent with measles. The person who caused this had multiple vaccines. The index patient, that is the patient who started the infection of others in New York, had 2 doses of measles containing vaccines, and 4 secondary cases were confirmed who had 2 doses of measles containing vaccines or measles antibodies. So why did those measles antibodies not protect? We will come to that. So there are 2 elements to this problem. One is that measles vaccine is itself causing measles, and the second is that measles vaccine is not producing immunity that protects either against natural measles or the vaccine-induced measles. Now, vaccine failure is not simply an inconvenience. It makes vaccines more dangerous. A very good example is mumps. Mumps was a trivial disease in children. It is not a trivial disease, as you know, in postpubertal males in particular. It can lead to testicular inflammation and infertility. Of course, there is an epidemic of infertility. Are the two linked? We don't know. If you have a vaccine that does not work, there is primary failure because the vaccine doesn't cause you to become immune when you're exposed to it, or secondary failure, that immunity wears off very quickly, or tertiary failure that no one wants to talk about, and that is where you use subsequent generations of the original virus in the laboratory to produce the next generation of vaccines. And over time, that virus is not the original one that they isolated years ago. It's mutated and mutated and mutated, and it's no longer producing a vaccine that's protective. And that's a nightmare. So primary, secondary, and tertiary vaccine failure. Then what you do is you give people temporary immunity or none at all, and then they are susceptible to to mumps when it is a more dangerous disease. You merely put off the problem. And so mumps vaccination has made mumps a more dangerous disease. It's not simply that it's an inconvenience because it doesn't work. It is actually producing a more dangerous disease. So we need to understand man's relationship to measles and how that has co-evolved. Fatal measles cases highlight the importance of herd immunity. So I just want to dwell on this notion of herd immunity. It's used, Pan's translated it with the help of Paul Offit and others into community immunity. What an irritating thing that is. I have to kind of take a deep breath when I say community immunity. But the notion of what herd immunity really is, and I want to talk about that now. Before vaccination, there was natural herd immunity. This is an extremely important division into the pre-vaccine era, natural herd immunity, and the vaccine era, this quasi-herd immunity that is now talked of. So, natural herd immunity in the pre-vaccine era. This clearly did not operate to prevent measles infection. Indeed, what it did, natural herd immunity at the population level acted to permit infection, to encourage measles infection at a time when it was least dangerous. So measles is most dangerous to infants under the age of 1, presumably, intuitively, because their immune system has yet to develop fully, and adults. So what happened is that natural herd immunity operated to constrain the age of measles to childhood, when it was an increasingly trivial disease. And that led to an extraordinary effect. And that was this. And you've seen this graph, but if you take nothing else away from this talk, this is the most extraordinary example of natural herd immunity in operation. This is from the UK, but I could show you this same graph from any developed country that collected measles data over a protracted period. But you can see that in 1920, measles was a major killer of children during epidemics. 1,200 per million children dying during epidemics. And then there was this extraordinary, this precipitous fall in case fatality rate to the point where by the time the single measles vaccine had been introduced, there had been a 99.96% reduction in case fatality. Now, people will say, well, that's just mortality. What about the disease itself? Mortality is the worst end of the severity of morbidity, the experiencing of the disease itself. So this is a very good proxy for measles getting milder and milder and milder. Death is just the worst outcome. So measles was becoming a dramatically milder disease. Now, the first question you might ask is, well, what would have happened if we'd never intervened with vaccination? Looking at this graph, clearly it would have continued to approach zero. There would have been no mortality at all. Measles would be an extremely mild disease. But of course, we can't say what would have happened because we intervened. And all the benefit of this is ascribed to vaccination, when that is totally inappropriate.
So there's Dr. Andrew Wakefield, the discredited, in inverted commas, Andrew Wakefield there, Martin, talking about the herd immunity versus the idea of using a vaccine. And one thing I can definitely say is that the vaccines being used, particularly on young children, have not been approved, because what's happened is individual vaccines as a single injection have been approved, and then what's happened is that Big Pharma has put these vaccines into younger and younger children, and also as multiple vaccines, sometimes 7 vaccines at once, and 5 vaccines at once. One is called Infanrix Hexa, for example, which is 5 vaccines going into the child all at once, without that going through clinical trials to see whether the child can cope with 5 vaccines. Only the individual vaccines are actually being tested. Anyway, what do you make of this? I think you're not quite so much of someone who is a believer in Wakefield and herd immunity as I am, are you?
No, well, listen, I am very well aware that Big Pharma do not have the best interests of the population at heart. So when they say, have this vaccine, I go, no, I don't trust you to do it. In theory, what I would like to see is a World Health Organization run by democratically controlled governments with no private sector interference. Vaccination clearly is a tool for human beings to control disease. It's not the only tool, and the real problem is the distortion of our healthcare system completely by private interests and private profiteering. And Ivan Illich, the radical social philosopher, wrote a book in 1964 called Medical Nemesis, about how the healthcare system, particularly in the US, was basically an illness system. And Goldman Sachs were at some meeting with the pharmaceutical companies, and they said, well, curing people is not a very good business model. So what we're dealing with here is people who make money out of misery and are quite blatant in doing it. Now, if we're going to have a better system, it's got to be a publicly accountable system, and it's not got to be based on private profit, a bit like the system in Cuba, for example, rather than the system in the US.
So how does that work?
Well, in Cuba, you've basically got the government runs healthcare, and they've got the highest proportion of doctors per head in the world. And the Cuban doctors go all over the world. They're going all over the world now, helping people. When the earthquake happened in Haiti, Cuban doctors were already working in the slums in Haiti. That's what Cuban doctors do. They've gone all over Latin America. They're working in Venezuela. They were kicked out of Brazil when Bolsonaro became to power last year. But they've been working in the Brazilian favelas for years. So the Cubans have been working on the front line in the most disadvantaged communities all over the world for years. And of course, their healthcare inside Cuba is excellent. And of course, they're able, because they're under blockade by the US, they're in a very strong position to deal with any coronavirus outbreak that they get. I'm not even sure they've had one yet.
Okay, so look, as a sort of final thing to look at, I mean, we're talking about the deep state and much bigger corporations. I mean, the Bilderberg group, the people that go along to those sorts of meetings, the bankers. We're talking about, people that own massive media empires going along to these meetings. Can you just give us an idea of how you think the deep state actually could get its act together enough to organise something like this?
Well, they've been doing it for years. It's partly trial and error. And also, you do one thing like 9/11, and you learn, you then work out how people react to that. You can model the follow-ons and all the rest of it. What I would say is that as the deep state in the West has got a serious opposition in the deep state in China and in Russia. So we're not just dealing with little people like you and me, belly aching in the corner. This is where the World War aspect comes in. The people like that have got the resources to know what's going on. They do know. I'm quite sure that Shoigu, for example, who's the long-standing Russian defense minister, will know everything that we're talking about and a lot more. And of course, they don't say much. They're tight-lipped.
But Martin, nobody wants a world war. Imagine how devastating that would be now.
Well, what the Iranian defense minister said yesterday in a tweet is Iran doesn't start wars. It just teaches lessons to those who do. That's the attitude.
Okay, so you'll find this show's podcast, story links, comment page, and our contact details at thisweekoneword.org.uk. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling. Here's wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable lockdown BCFM weekend. I'll be back in the UK at some point over the next few months, God willing. Do please join us for the BCFM emergency schedule politics show. I must also credit Martin Summers. Thanks very much, Martin. And this is day 8 of lockdown on Friday, or on FM maybe at 10 p.m. on Monday. We shall see. 10 p.m. is the dialect programme. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.